All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome if you've just joined us. And our next speaker is going to be Greg RAHN, and he's going to be talking about writing music for an iconic Hollywood IP, scoring the soundtrack for Kabam's The Hobbit, Armies of the Third Age. A little bit about Greg. He's been composing music for games since the early 90s. He's worked on over 200 game soundtracks. He currently heads up the audio team at Kabam in San Francisco. Prior to that, Greg owned and operated SoundMind's music and sound design. And he's also a keyboard player. He's shared the stage with such greats as Bill Champlin, Ronnie Montrose, Davey Pattison, Pete Escovedo, and Chris Kane. Please welcome Greg RAHN.
Thank you, and I think we should give a hand to RAHN for setting up the whole audio track for us. Once again, here we are on session number 2, and he's already put out about half a dozen fires so far this morning, so hopefully it all goes smooth from here. So earlier this year, Kabam released their second game based on the Lord of the Rings franchise. It's called The Hobbit, Armies of the Third Age. And today I'm going to talk to you about the process I went through to compose the music for this game. I'm going to take you from when we first got the green light to do the orchestra, through the sketches, the composing process. I'm going to talk about the orchestration process, scheduling the orchestra, care and feeding of the orchestra, video documentation, which I'm going to play that for you at the end, and then, of course, mixing and implementing the sounds into the game. So here's a movie poster from the Hobbit movie, and pay particular close attention to the date, December 14th. Okay, that's the date the movie was set to release, and so that was the date we chose to release our game. So that was the game launch date. It was supposed to be synchronous with the movie date. And since games never slip, we totally hit that date. Not. One of the good things about working with a licensed IP is that the style guide is basically set. So you know exactly what you're going for. You know the target. It's very clear. In this case, it was Howard Shore's music from all the Lord of the Rings movies. One of the more challenging things is the approval process. Now, every IP has stakeholders. In this case, it was the Saul Zaentz company who owned all the rights to the books, the Tolkien books, and Warner Brothers, who of course owned the rights to the movies. So anything we did, whether it was art or music, it had to be sent up to them and approved before we could put it in the game. And that cycle was a 2-week turnaround. So basically we'd submit stuff, and then they promised that within 2 weeks they'd have an answer for us as to whether we could put it in the game, or we had to revise it or scrap it altogether and start over. So that was particularly challenging, especially since when we get to the scheduling part, you'll see how much time we had. Before you can schedule an orchestra, obviously you got to know exactly what it's going to be and what it's going to consist of. At the point we got the green light for the orchestra, I had, I think, maybe 5 minutes of music approved, so I had a general idea, actually a pretty accurate idea of what I was going to go for in the orchestra, and it looks like this. You'll notice there's no recorder or penny whistle. Penny whistle is a big part of the franchise soundtrack. So I did those as an overdub. It's a really unique instrument. There aren't many people who double. I thought, oh, I'll just get one of the flute players to double on penny whistle. It doesn't work that way. It's a very niche thing. So I had a separate guy come in and overdub penny whistle later. We had one of the string players played recorder. So we planned to have him overdub the recorder in the same room as the rest of the orchestra, as a separate overdub, so we'd get that room sound. And I'll cover more on how that went in my what went wrong section. So you'll also notice that there's no percussion in this orchestra. That's because we decided that, for one, percussion leaks into all the other mics, so it's in there when you're mixing and you can't get it out. It's more people to get a perfect take from. And the sample percussion sounds so good as it is, I decided just to go with that, have that in the tracks, and then just record strings, horns, and woodwinds. So So here it is, November 1st, and my producer says, okay, Greg, you got the green light. Let's do the live orchestra thing that you've been asking me about for 6 months. And we just like to see you squirm. So remember that date, December 14th. So we had to work backwards from that. I knew I wanted to have at least 2 weeks to do overdubs, mixing, and implementation into the game. So that put the session at November 30th. I knew my orchestrator said he needed 2 to 4 days to finish up the final orchestration and get the charts printed. So we put that on the 26th. And remember that 2-week approval process. That means I've got to have my final piece in the pipeline to get approved by the 16th. And here it is, November 1st. So, and it's November. I mean, look at this. We got Thanksgiving, we got Veterans Day, we got Election Day, it was election year, and Daylight Savings, so the days get shorter. So everything was working against me on that one. But, so I just got to work and put in some long hours and weekends, and we got it done. And we actually also, this was really a saving grace, we requested, can we shorten this 2-week approval process since we're in such crunch mode? And so they did. They said, okay, we'll commit to 5-day turnaround. And in some cases, they actually did it in less than that. So that really helped a lot as well. So let's talk a little bit about the composing process. I know we got a lot of composers in the room, so some of you will probably be able to relate to some of this stuff. Whenever I work on an IP, I like to first of all immerse myself in all the content of whatever it is they have, whether it's books or movies. So I watched all the Lord of the Rings movies again, I read the Hobbit book again. And I also decided to change my usual composing approach, which is, I'll tend to, I try to avoid what I call polishing a turd. So I tend to come up with an idea. I think seems like a good idea at the time, and I start orchestrating it and fleshing out all the parts, and hours later, I've got this final thing that I think is done, and I listen to it, and I just have to accept that this particular thing is not so good. It's not a piece of music, it's really a piece of crap, and I just wasted all that time working on this thing. So to avoid that, I decided to discipline myself to just write piano sketches at first. And if I wrote something I thought was going to be good, then I'd notate it just in a lead sheet form, just melody and chords, and then I'd set it aside and move on to another piece. And I'd come back and revisit it later, maybe even the next day is good, because then it's clear out of my head. And if I still think it's going to hold up, then I'll proceed and flesh it all out and go down the whole path of that. And that really helped. In the end, I ended up batting 1,000. Everything I set up to them, they approved. And I think that changing that really helped me not get any revision requests. So what I would do is every time they sent one back that was approved, then I'd send that off to the orchestrator to start orchestrating. And then I'd start working on the next piece. And then he, a few days later, of course, would send me the score for proofreading, and I'd stop composing, proofread that, send it back to him, okay to go ahead and print, and then go back to composing again. So that was the process, and this went on for the whole month of November. And we ended up with 28 minutes of music altogether. So one of the challenges in getting my Logic files over to the orchestrator was rubato pieces. A lot of this stuff I wrote rubato, and when I write rubato, I don't even turn on the click or try to match it up at all. I just hit record and I start playing, then I come back and play the next part over that until I've got a piece. The problem with that is if an orchestrator looks at it, there's no time, there's no meter, there's no measures for him to line everything up to. So he calls me up, he says, Greg, I think I can guess where you're going with this and where the timing should be, but you're the composer, maybe it's better if you define it, and then I'll make sure I'll have it right. So that was some added time that I didn't count on doing, and so I used Logic's beat map to line everything up. And it's pretty cool because you can grab any note or any chord you want and then assign it to a beat. And you go from the beginning of the piece and you just work your way through to the end, and everything stays timed exactly the same, but now there's actually measures that make sense. So then the orchestrator can do his thing. So here it is, recording day. We did this up at Bastyr University up near Seattle. It's a great sounding room. It's basically a chapel, and it sounds fantastic, and they've got it down to a science. Here, let me skip ahead to this picture. There's a picture of the room with the orchestra in it. They come in and they'll set up this whole plywood stage over the altar, set up all the mics, headphones, run everything, and at the end of the day, they strike it all, and it's back to being a chapel. It's pretty cool. Behind the altar there is where the control room is. And back here we have a video feed, so we can see everything, and we have, of course, all the audio, and talkback mics so I can talk to the conductor. So the plan was we'd record from 1:30 to 5:30 with the full orchestra, then take a dinner break, then from 6:30 to 8:30 do the orchestra, whatever's left, and do some overdubs, and then do the choir from 9 to 11. So the best laid plans don't always go as planned. One of the snags we ran into was the violinist who was going to double on recorder apparently didn't get the memo that he was going to do that. So he didn't bring his A recorder, and but then he said, well, you know what, let me check my trunk. I might have an old recorder in there. So he goes in, gets out this old beat-up recorder out of his truck, and says, okay, I'll do it with this one. So he brings that out, and he starts doing his part, and you know, it wasn't his A recorder, so he was wrestling with the thing, and it took a while to get it down. But in the end, we got it, but it took some extra time. It took more than we had anticipated. When we did the choir, one of the singers, which was actually a soloist, was ill, but he showed up anyway and tried to do his best, and it definitely affected his intonation. So that resulted in, you know, we had to melodyne his voice and get him in tune, and that added time. Of course, that was after the fact, so it didn't really add time to that day, so it wasn't too bad. And then there was one moment when the conductor stops everything and says, well, look, we got the same part in the cellos and the same part in the violins, but no articulation markings in the cellos. So how do you want them to articulate that? And I'm like, oops. So that was my proofreading, right? When I was composing and then stopping to proofread, and I didn't put enough time and attention to it, and I missed that. So luckily the orchestrator had brought a printer and all the files, and he just put it all in, reprinted the parts, get them to the cello section, and we carried on. But you know, that was 10 minutes. So a few of those, and your day starts you start to get behind. When we got to the choir, I spent way too much time on the first piece, and suddenly realized, oh, I got all these other pieces we got to do. We're going to have to just move on here. And in the end, we ended up having to purchase 2 more hours for choir and the recording crew to get it done. So instead of finishing at 11, we finished at midnight. No, 1 a.m. So that added a little time. No biggie, though. So finished the recording session. Then I brought it home, took it to Skywalker Sound for mixing. What can I say about this? This went fantastic. Leslie Ann Jones is a great mixer. She mixes orchestral stuff all the time. It was a great process. I think the only snag we ran into was when you have an orchestra play to a click, even though the conductor and everybody's hearing the click and he's conducting, everything happens after the beat with the orchestra. It's like this big moving monster, right? So everything's behind. And some of my music had odd time signatures and transitions. And some of those, the orchestra would take a little bit longer to navigate than the click track did. So when we were mixing, we started to notice a few discrepancies. So we had to shift some of the original percussion tracks to match the live orchestra. So that fluctuating is actually all part of what makes it sound so great and so live. So we wanted to keep all that intact. And now the orchestra ruled, and we had to adjust the other tracks to fit. And this is Dan on the opposite side of me there. He's the Pro Tools engineer, and he ran Pro Tools while Leslie mixed everything. So this is the game development spreadsheet that we use to implement the game, the audio into the game. So what you're looking at here is, it's kind of small, isn't it? These are all phrases. What I did was, in addition to writing full pieces, I wrote a bunch of short phrases. One of the things I love about movies is that you can have a scene where people are talking. You got a dialogue going on between 2 characters, and the underscore will kind of swell up underneath them from time to time to kind of punch certain points in the dialogue. and then kind of fade away, and then it'll come back again, and it's, it's beautiful. It's underscored, and it's really an effective thing. So I wanted to try to bring that cinematic approach to the game as best as I could. We were really limited in how we could implement things, but we had this great programmer who cared a lot about sound and came up with this way to do it. And here's all the phrases. We had like 25, I think, phrases, or 21 phrases for each faction. So this is the elf faction, and this is all their phrases. Over here, this is the delay column. So these get picked randomly while the game is being played. And then the timing here delays the start of the sound file. So when this sound file gets queued up, it waits. These are all in milliseconds, of course. Bless our programmer. So 300,000 milliseconds before it plays this track. So can anybody tell me how many minutes is 300,000 milliseconds? There's a beer in it for you. You got it? 5? You got it. 5 minutes. I'll give you a beer. So what happens is the player's playing the game. He's going through building a city and doing all the game activities. And 5 minutes will go by where all he's hearing is the ambient sound of the game and the game sounds. And then all of a sudden, one of these phrases will kind of creep up underneath while he's playing, and then fade out, and then a little more time goes by, and another one randomly comes up. So it was kind of my pseudo way of creating this underscore in a cinematic way. And when we tested it, it actually worked out pretty good. Pretty happy with the results. So here is I mentioned video documentation. I think it's really important to document things like this because it's kind of like making a behind-the-scenes movie, making of kind of video. Fans love to look at these things. I love to look at these things. And so we made one, and actually Matt is the guy right here. He recorded it all and edited it and put it all together for us. So I'm going to play that for you now. Thank you very much. Do we have time for any questions? Q&A, anybody? You gotta come up and talk in the mic because we're recording.
I was curious how many tracks you ended up having in Pro Tools.
How many tracks did we end up in Pro Tools? What did we end up with? Do you remember, Matt? Was it? I think it was only like 32 or something. It wasn't as high as I thought it would be. Yeah.
Please use the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Your orchestra and your choir, I don't think you mentioned where you
Right.
got them or who they were.
Yeah, the orchestra was the Northwest Symphonium, and they're all based out of Seattle. And then the choir, I forget what they called the choir, but it was also a Seattle-based choir, and
Why Seattle?
really good. I guess that's where the Seattle Symphony is, I guess, and that's where most of the players come from, I think. Yeah.
Did I hear you correctly that you were saying you send Warner Brothers the lead sheet of the score, and then you get that back and orchestrate it, or?
Oh, no, sorry. The lead sheets were just for my notes. I
Okay.
would just do that so I could put it away and not forget it and come back and revisit it. What I would do then is I would flesh it all out in Logic with the sample libraries,
Oh, okay.
and then send those up to Warner Brothers for approval.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how does working with an orchestrator change your composing process, and especially as you're writing in the sample libraries?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things you got to be concerned about with the sample libraries is, of course, ranges, because some of the libraries will let you play and record parts and write parts that aren't in the instrument range. So you really have to be careful of that and stay within their range. It's nice that you have an orchestrator that will catch that stuff and say, hey, this isn't going to work in this range. Like I originally wrote one of the vocal pieces for the choir, had a low D in it, and he pointed out that there aren't very many singers who can hit that low D. So we moved the whole thing up a whole step. So that was really helpful, having the orchestrator. That's it? Anything else? There's one.
So on the spreadsheet where you set out the milliseconds and everything, are you given certain specs on by the developers on what specs what they want for as far as the milliseconds or the coding on the file?
That was
names and things
like
like
kind of a collaboration between the programmer and us, and we basically said, we want to do this, and he'd go, let me see if I can figure out a way to do that, and then he'd come up with it.
Okay.
So it's good when you have a programmer who's really invested in making the audio work. Another question?
You mentioned that you didn't record the percussion with live orchestra. Was that correct?
Yes.
So did you just overdub that later?
No, what we did was we set up the Pro Tools sessions with the click track and all the percussion tracks in there. And we even put in some reference tracks from some of the other parts as well.
Okay.
So then they could either, with the people with the headphones, all the musicians could either hear the percussion or have it muted if they wanted and just hear the clicks, so they had options. But it was all in there, and then they played to that and the conductor conducted to that.
And were those live drums or samples?
They were all samples.
Oh, cool.
No other questions? Well, thank you very much.